10 prehistoric migrations that rewrote human history. Human history was not shaped by one journey out of Africa. For more than 2 million years, different human populations crossed deserts, mountains, seas, and ice. Some survived, others vanished, leaving only tools, fossils, footprints, or fragments of DNA. These are the 10 migrations that changed what humanity became. Number 10. Neanderthals move east into Siberia. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals seemed to belong mainly to Europe. Their fossils had been found from the Iberian Peninsula to the eastern Mediterranean. They were associated with caves, cold environments, large animals, and the stone technology commonly called Mousterian. Siberia peered far beyond their familiar world. Then discoveries in the Altai Mountains changed the map. The Altai lies where modern Russia approaches Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. It is thousands of kilometers east of the best-known Neanderthal sites in Western Europe. Yet several caves in this region preserve evidence that Neanderthals reached southern Siberia more than once. At Okladnikov Cave, fragmented human remains were eventually identified as Neanderthal through genetic analysis. At Denisovan Cave, traces of Neanderthal DNA appeared alongside evidence from Denisovans and Homo sapiens. But Shagirskaya Cave provided the clearest picture. Excavations recovered thousands of stone artifacts, animal bones, and Neanderthal remains. The tools were not merely local versions of a general Neanderthal technology. Many closely resembled Makokian tools known from Central and Eastern Europe. These included distinctive bifacial implements shaped on both surfaces. The similarities suggested that technological traditions had moved east with the people who made them. Genetic evidence strengthened that conclusion. The Neanderthals from Chagirskaya were more closely related to some European Neanderthals than to an older Neanderthal population represented at nearby Denisova Cave. The Neanderthal presence in the Altai was therefore unlikely to have come from one isolated population remaining there for an immense period. Different groups appear to have entered the region during separate movements. Their journeys would have crossed broad belts of Eurasian grassland and steppe. These landscapes supported horses, bison, reindeer, and other large mammals. Neanderthal groups may have followed changing animal populations as climate altered the distribution of prey and vegetation. But moving across a continent required more than following a herd. Groups had to locate unfamiliar stone sources, adapt their hunting methods, understand new seasonal cycles, and maintain connections with people beyond their immediate community. At Shagirskaya, the genetic evidence points to a relatively small local population. Some individuals were closely related. Movement between neighboring groups may have helped preserve wider social connections and provide partners outside the immediate family. This was probably not a planned expedition from Europe to Siberia. There was no single departure point and no distant destination known in advance. The movement may have unfolded over hundreds of generations. One group entered a neighboring hunting range. Their descendants moved farther. Climate changed, prey shifted, and people followed. The result is unmistakable. Neanderthals carried ancestry, technical knowledge, and social traditions across a major part of Eurasia. They were not trapped inside one ecological corner of Europe. They could expand, withdraw, and return. Yet, reaching a distant region did not guarantee that a population would survive into the future. Our own species discovered that long before the expansion that eventually transformed the world. Number 9. The early Homo sapiens migrations that disappeared. For decades, one date dominated the story of modern human expansion. Around 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens left Africa and spread into Eurasia. It was a clear explanation. The evidence became much less clear. Fossils now show that members of our species entered Southwest Asia far earlier. At Mislia Cave in Israel, researchers examined part of an upper jaw containing several teeth. Its anatomy was consistent with Homo sapiens. Dating placed it between approximately 177,000 and 194,000 years ago. That was far earlier than the movement once treated as the beginning of modern human life outside Africa. Other sites in the Levant preserve evidence of early Homo sapiens at different times. But the Levant was not the only route. In the Arabian Peninsula, a single finger bone recovered at Al Wusta revealed another movement. Today, the site lies inside a desert. When that individual lived, around 85,000 years ago, the environment looked very different. Rainfall had created lakes, grasslands, and freshwater habitats across parts of Arabia. Animals moved through those landscapes, and human groups could follow them. Stone tools and animal remains from other Arabian sites show that these humid phases occurred repeatedly. The desert did not remain open. Rainfall weakened. Lakes contracted. Grasslands disappeared. Routes that had supported human movement became dry and difficult. This pattern may explain why Homo sapiens entered the region several times. Each humid phase created a temporary opportunity. Then the corridor closed. What happened to the people who used those routes remains uncertain. Some may have moved back toward Africa or the Levant as conditions worsened. Some may have survived in isolated refuges. Others may have died out. They may also have contributed some ancestry to later populations. But genetic evidence indicates that most living people outside Africa trace the majority of their ancestry to a later expansion. That distinction matters. A fossil proves that someone arrived. It does not prove that their population endured. The early people represented at Mislia, Al Wusta, and related sites were anatomically modern humans. Their bodies belonged to our species. But anatomy could not protect a small population from drought, disease, isolation, or simple demographic collapse. Small communities are vulnerable. A few failed hunting seasons can become a crisis. The loss of neighboring groups can reduce access to partners, resources, and shared knowledge. Even a population that survives for generations may later be absorbed by another group and leave little detectable ancestry of its own. This creates a serious archaeological problem. When a population disappears, its tools may remain. But similar stone tools can be produced by different people. A fossil may establish identity, but fossils are rare. DNA can reveal ancestry, but heat and humidity destroy it quickly. The result is a prehistoric record filled with arrivals whose later fate cannot be followed. These early migrations changed scientific thinking because they overturned the idea of one clean departure from Africa. Homo sapiens crossed the continent's boundaries repeatedly. Some groups may have traveled farther into Asia than current fossils can demonstrate. But the evidence also shows that leaving Africa was not the same as establishing a permanent population beyond it. Some journeys ended. Some routes closed. Some people vanished. Then, on an island east of the Asian continental shelf, another human population crossed a barrier that changing climate could never remove completely. Open water. Number 8. The first hominins to reach Flores. Flores is one of the islands of Indonesia. It lies east of Bali and Java, beyond a biological boundary known as the Wallace Line. During the Ice Age, falling sea levels exposed large areas of the Sunda Shelf. Mainland Southeast Asia became connected to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. Flores remained separate. Deep marine channels continued to divide it from the islands to the west. Any hominin that reached Flores had to cross water. At the Soa Basin in central Flores, archaeologists found stone tools inside ancient sediment layers. The artifacts indicate that hominins were already present on the island around 1 million years ago. No human fossil from that early occupation has identified the travelers with certainty. They may have descended from Homo erectus populations living farther west. Whatever their exact identity, they crossed a marine boundary long before Homo sapiens entered the region. The crossing has inspired several explanations. A small group could have been swept into the sea during a storm, while clinging to a natural raft of vegetation. Floods, volcanic activity, or tsunamis may have carried people and debris away from shore. Another possibility is that hominins used some form of simple watercraft. No boat, paddle, rope launch site has survived from that period. The evidence proves that a crossing occurred. It does not reveal how it happened. Accidental movement is possible, but the creation of a lasting population introduces another problem. One individual would not be enough. Even several people might fail to establish a viable community unless both sexes survived, food could be found, and reproduction continued successfully. The settlement of Flores may therefore have required more than one arrival. Repeated accidental crossings could gradually create a population. Some form of deliberate movement cannot be ruled out, but it cannot be presented as established fact. Once hominins reached Flores, isolation changed their evolutionary future. The island supported unusual animals, including dwarf stegodonts, giant rats, and large reptiles. Resources were limited compared with a continent. Over long periods, isolated species often become larger or smaller as they adjust to new ecological pressures. Hundreds of thousands of years after the earliest tools, Flores was home to Homo floresiensis. The best-known skeleton, discovered at Liangbua, belonged to an adult who stood only a little over 1 meter tall. The species had a small brain, a short body, and a combination of anatomical features not found in any living human population. The relationship between the first toolmakers and Homo floresiensis remains debated. Early fossil remains from Matamenje indicate that small-bodied hominins were already living on Flores hundreds of thousands of years before the population known from Liangbua. That supports a long local evolutionary history. A crossing that may have lasted only hours or days could have created an isolated lineage that endured for an immense span of time. The first hominins to reach Flores could not have known what their arrival would begin. They entered one island. Their descendants became something distinct. But Flores was only one small part of Asia. Another extinct human lineage spread across environments ranging from Siberian caves to high mountain plateaus, and perhaps as far as tropical Southeast Asia. Scientists first recognized them from a fragment of bone smaller than a finger. Number 7. The Denisovan expansion across Asia. In 2008, archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains recovered a small fragment from a finger bone. It did not look like a discovery that would redraw the human family tree. The fragment was too incomplete to identify through anatomy alone. Researchers extracted DNA. The genome did not belong to Homo sapiens. It was also distinct from Neanderthal DNA. The bone came from a previously unknown human population. They became known as Denisovans. At first, their known world seemed limited to one Siberian cave. Further discoveries quickly complicated that picture. Large molar teeth from Denisova Cave carried Denisovan genetic signatures. Ancient DNA recovered directly from cave sediments showed that Denisovans occupied the site at different times. Then evidence appeared far to the south. A partial lower jaw found in Baishiakar's cave on the Tibetan plateau had been discovered years earlier. No usable DNA survived inside it. Instead, researchers studied ancient proteins preserved in the teeth. The results linked the jaw to Denisovans. The fossil was at least 160,000 years old. That placed a Denisovan-related population on the Tibetan plateau, more than 3,000 meters above sea level, long before modern populations appeared there. The plateau presents severe challenges. Oxygen is limited. Winters are cold. Plant productivity is low. Large areas are exposed to powerful winds. The presence of Denisovans suggests that they could survive in conditions far beyond the forest and steppe environments associated with the Altai. Later evidence from Baishia Karst Cave, including sediment traces and another fossil fragment, indicated that Denisovan-related populations occupied the region across a long period. their biological legacy may still survive. Many living Tibetan people carry a version of the EPS1 gene associated with adaptation to high altitude. Genetic research indicates that this variant entered the ancestors of modern populations through interbreeding with a Denisovan-related group. Denisovan migration did more than carry people across a landscape. It transferred adaptations between human lineages. Another possible clue appeared in Laos. A large human molar from Tam Ngu Hau II, also known as Cobra Cave, shares features with Denisovan teeth. The identification remains cautious because DNA has not confirmed it. But if the tooth belonged to a Denisovan-related individual, their range may have extended from cold Siberia to tropical mainland Southeast Asia. Living populations provide additional evidence. People in parts of Oceania carry substantial Denisovan-related ancestry. Smaller amounts appear across many Asian populations. This pattern is difficult to explain through one encounter with one uniform Denisovan group. Genetic studies suggest that the ancestors of Homo sapiens interbred with several Denisovan-related populations. That creates a larger question. What exactly was a Denisovan? The name may not describe one biologically uniform population spread across Asia. It may refer to several related groups that had separated from one another over long periods. Some lived in Siberia. Some occupied the Tibetan plateau. Others may have survived farther south. Their faces remain largely unknown. Their tools are difficult to identify with certainty. Their fossil record is extremely small. Yet their DNA reveals that they occupied a vast range of environments and encountered the ancestors of living people. The Denisovan story is a migration reconstructed in reverse. Scientists began with inherited genes, then searched the landscape for the populations that carried them. While Denisovan-related groups were moving through Asia, Homo sapiens was entering the continent as well. One discovery in a limestone cave showed that some of those travelers moved through environments where fossils rarely survive. Number 6. Homo sapiens enter tropical Southeast Asia. Tropical forests can hide an immense human history. Heat, humidity, acidic soils, and constant biological activity destroy bone. Rivers move sediment. Caves flood. Vegetation covers exposed surfaces. For many years, the scarcity of early human fossils in Southeast Asia encouraged a simple migration model. Modern humans may have moved east mainly along coastlines, using marine resources while avoiding the difficult interior. Tam Pa Ling challenged that picture. The cave lies in northern Laos, far from the modern coast. Inside, researchers recovered fragments of human skulls, jaws, and other bones from deep sediment layers. The remains belonged to Homo sapiens. Dating the site was difficult because the fossils were not found beside material that could be measured through one simple method. Researchers studied the surrounding sediments, mineral deposits, and the history of how the bones entered the cave. The results indicated that modern humans were present in the region at least around 70,000 years ago, with some evidence potentially extending earlier. The chronology has continued to be refined. The broader conclusion remains. Homo sapiens reached mainland Southeast Asia surprisingly early. These were not people traveling only along an exposed shoreline. They occupied an inland landscape of forests, rivers, limestone hills, and caves. That environment required specialized knowledge. Tropical plants can be abundant, but many are seasonal, toxic, or protected by hard shells. Animals are often scattered rather than concentrated into large herds. Visibility is limited. Tools made from bamboo, wood, fiber, and other organic materials may have been essential, but they rarely survive. The archaeological record may therefore underestimate the technology of tropical populations. A forest toolkit does not preserve like a stone toolkit. Tam Pa Ling also exposes a problem that appears throughout this story. Were these people ancestors of later populations? Or did they belong to another early expansion that eventually disappeared? The fossils prove that Homo sapiens reached the region. They do not show how much ancestry those individuals contributed to people living in Southeast Asia today. Genetic evidence points to complex movements through the continent. Different populations separated, mixed, and traveled along mainland and island routes. Some encountered Denisovan-related groups. Others eventually contributed to the settlement of Sahul. The old picture of one coastal wave moving rapidly eastward is no longer enough. There may have been coastal movements, inland movements, and repeated arrivals during different climatic periods. Rivers could act as corridors. Mountain passes could connect valleys. Caves might preserve brief occupations within a much wider landscape. The absence of fossils between known sites may not represent empty territory. It may represent poor preservation. That distinction changes the map. In Europe and Western Asia, cold caves often protect bone. In tropical Asia, entire populations may disappear from the physical record while leaving only indirect genetic traces. Tampaling demonstrates that early Homo sapiens could move through humid inland environments. The next migration went toward the opposite extreme. Instead of heat, rain, and dense vegetation, people entered a world of severe cold, seasonal darkness, and frozen ground. They reached the Arctic long before the last ice age ended. Number 5. Humans enter the Arctic and Beringia. Near the Yana River in northeastern Siberia, archaeological sites preserve evidence of human activity inside the Arctic Circle around 32,000 years ago. These people did not arrive during a warm and forgiving period. They lived before the coldest stage of the last glacial maximum. Winter temperatures were severe. Darkness lasted for long periods. Plant foods were limited through much of the year. Survival depended heavily on animals. At Yana, archaeologists found thousands of animal bones and objects made from mammoth ivory. People hunted or scavenged large mammals and transformed ivory into tools and other objects. The site reveals planning across seasons. Meat could be eaten, stored, shared, or transported. Hides could become clothing and shelter. Bone and ivory could replace wood where trees were scarce. No human body is naturally prepared for an Arctic winter without technology. People needed insulation. Clothing had to cover the body closely enough to preserve heat. Footwear was essential. Fire required fuel in a landscape where large trees might be absent. Shelters had to resist strong winds. Knowledge of animal migration could determine whether a group survived the winter. The expansion into northeastern Siberia was therefore a cultural achievement. Humans did not wait for the body to evolve thick fur. They carried solutions. Genetic evidence from ancient Siberian individuals shows that the population history of the region was complex. The people at Yana belonged to a lineage often called Ancient North Siberians. Later populations entered the region, mixed with some groups, and replaced or absorbed others. Eventually, ancestry related to East Asian populations and Northern Eurasian populations contributed to the formation of the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas. This process unfolded in and around Beringia. Beringia is often described as a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. During periods of lower sea level, it was much more than a narrow passage. It was a broad region of tundra, grassland, rivers, hills, and animal populations. For thousands of years, people may have lived within this northern world rather than simply crossing through it. Genetic models suggest that the ancestors of indigenous Americans became partly isolated from other populations before spreading into the Americas. The location and length of that isolation remain debated. It may have occurred within Beringia, in nearby parts of northeastern Asia, or across a wider connected region. The population at Yana was probably not identical to the group that later entered the Americas. But the site proves that people had already learned to survive at extreme northern latitudes long before that expansion. The Arctic was not an empty barrier waiting to be crossed. It became a human landscape with its own migrations, population mixtures, and disappearances. By 32,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had large brains, complex social systems, and diverse technologies. The first hominins to leave Africa possessed none of the equipment associated with later Arctic hunters. They entered Eurasia more than 1.5 million years earlier. Their brains were smaller. Their tools were simpler. Their success forced scientists to reconsider what migration required. Number 4. The first hominins enter Eurasia. Dmanisi is a medieval town in the country of Georgia. Beneath its ruins, archaeologists found evidence from a far older world. Animal bones, simple stone tools, and human fossils had been preserved in sediments dating to roughly 1.8 million years ago. The human remains were unlike the travelers scientists once expected to find at the beginning of the first migration out of Africa. The Dmanisi hominins had relatively small brains. Some individuals were small-bodied. Their tools were simple flakes, cores, and chopping implements, rather than the large, carefully shaped hand axes associated with later Acheulean technology. Older models had suggested that expansion into Eurasia required major advances. Perhaps a larger brain-enabled planning. Perhaps long legs made distant travel efficient. Perhaps more sophisticated tools provided reliable access to meat. Dmanisi showed that early hominins could enter Eurasia without the complete package. The site preserves several skulls, including individuals with striking anatomical variation. One elderly individual had lost most of their teeth long before death. The jawbone had healed, showing that the person survived for a considerable period, despite difficulty chewing. Whether that survival depended on direct care cannot be proven. Soft food, shared food, or individual adaptation may all have played a role. But the fossil reveals a group in which a vulnerable person remained alive. Animal remains at Dmanisi show that hominins had access to carcasses. Cut marks and stone tools indicate butchery. Large carnivores also occupied the landscape, meaning humans competed with predators and scavengers. The environment was seasonal. Winters were colder than in much of Africa. Food availability changed throughout the year. The population at Dmanisi survived those conditions with simple technology. The site remains the clearest early record because fossils, artifacts, and animal evidence appear together. But it may not represent the first entry into Eurasia. At Shangchen in central China, stone artifacts have been dated to as early as approximately 2.1 million years ago. No hominin fossil identifies the makers. Some European sites may also preserve evidence approaching or exceeding 2 million years, although the interpretation of the marks and artifacts remains debated. These discoveries raise a difficult possibility. The first migration out of Africa may have happened before the appearance of the human form represented at Dmanisi. Several populations may have expanded at different times. The route is also uncertain. Groups could have moved through the Levant, around the Caucasus, or through corridors that have not survived in the archaeological record. They did not need to understand that they were leaving one continent. Migration can emerge from ordinary decisions repeated across generations. A group follows animals into a neighboring valley. Their descendants settle farther north. Another generation moves beyond the previous seasonal range. Thousands of years later, the population occupies a new continent. There was probably no moment when early hominins looked toward Eurasia and decided to colonize it. Yet their movement began a pattern that continued for 2 million years. Different human populations repeatedly entered new environments before scientists believed they possessed the anatomy or technology to do so. The Dmanisi hominins crossed land. The first Homo sapiens population to establish itself in Sahul faced a more obvious obstacle. Between them and the new continent lay a chain of islands separated by open sea. Number 3. Humans cross into Sahul. During the Ice Age, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed parts of one larger landmass known as Sahul. Sea levels were lower, Because enormous volumes of water were locked inside glaciers. Exposed continental shelves transformed the coastlines of Southeast Asia. But Sahul never became connected to the Sunda Shelf of western Indonesia. Deep marine channels remained. To reach Sahul, people had to cross water more than once. The precise route is unknown. A northern path may have passed through islands toward New Guinea. A southern path may have moved through Timor toward northwestern Australia. Both required journeys beyond the immediate mainland. One of the most important sites in this debate is Majedbeb, a rock shelter in northern Australia. Excavations recovered stone tools, grinding stones, ochre, and other evidence of human activity. Some dating results place the earliest occupation around 65,000 years ago. That age remains debated. Other researchers support a later arrival, perhaps closer to 50,000 years ago. The difference matters, but both possibilities describe an early movement across a major maritime boundary. The first successful settlers did not enter a familiar world. Sahul contained animals and plants unlike those of Southeast Asia. Its landscapes included tropical coasts, woodlands, deserts, mountains, and river systems. People had to identify new foods, avoid unfamiliar dangers, locate reliable water, and adjust their hunting methods. The crossing itself creates another question. Could accidental drift establish a permanent population? A storm might carry several people from one island to another. Natural rafts can transport animals over long distances. But Sahul was not reached through one channel alone. The journey probably involved several island stages. A viable founding population also required enough people to reproduce and preserve social knowledge. Researchers have modeled possible crossings using wind, current, visibility, and population size. Some studies suggest that successful settlement was more likely if several vessels or repeated movements carried groups rather than isolated castaways. This does not prove that the first settlers built advanced boats. Simple rafts or watercraft made from perishable materials would leave little or no archaeological trace. The crossings may also have combined intention with accident. People could deliberately aim for a visible island and then be carried farther than expected. They may have learned routes gradually, moving first between islands already within sight before attempting longer passages. What matters is the outcome. A population reached Sahul and survived. Their descendants developed cultural traditions extending across tens of thousands of years. Genetic evidence from indigenous Australian and Papuan populations preserves deep regional ancestry. The settlement of Sahul was not a failed exploration. It created one of the longest continuous human histories outside Africa. The migration also changes how we think about prehistoric planning. At minimum, people had to approach the shoreline, enter the water, and survive the crossing with tools, knowledge, and social partners. Even if their watercraft were simple, the demographic achievement was not. The first settlers of Sahul moved from one ecological world into another and established a population that endured through dramatic climatic change. One major inhabited region still remained beyond the known human range. To reach it, people would move through Beringia and enter continents separated from the rest of the populated world by ice, ocean, and distance. Number 2. The peopling of the Americas. For much of the 20th century, the Clovis culture stood at the beginning of American prehistory. Clovis sites, identified by distinctive fluted stone points, appeared across much of North America around 13,000 years ago. The timing seemed to fit a migration through an ice-free corridor that opened between the continental ice sheets near the end of the last ice age. This became the Clovis first model. Then earlier sites began to accumulate. Some were controversial because their stone artifacts were difficult to distinguish from naturally fractured rock. Others had uncertain dates, but the evidence gradually became harder to dismiss. Sites in both North and South America indicated human presence before Clovis. One of the most striking discoveries came from white sands in New Mexico. There, human footprints were preserved in sediments beside an ancient lake. Some tracks were made by children and adolescents. Others belonged to adults. They crossed surfaces also marked by mammoths, giant ground sloths, and other Ice Age animals. Initial dating suggested that the footprints were approximately 23,000 to 21,000 years old. That would place people in North America during the last glacial maximum, when enormous ice sheets covered much of Canada and parts of the northern United States. The dates immediately attracted scrutiny. The original measurements relied partly on aquatic plant seeds, which can absorb old carbon and appear older than they are. Researchers returned with additional methods, including pollen dating and analysis of the surrounding sediments. The later results supported the earlier age range. Debate continues, as it should, for evidence that changes a major model. But white sands now forms part of a wider record, indicating that people reached the Americas before Clovis. If humans were already south of the ice sheets during the last glacial maximum, how did they arrive? The interior ice-free corridor was not always open or ecologically usable. A Pacific coastal route has therefore become increasingly important. Lower sea levels exposed coastlines that are now underwater. People could have moved through marine environments using fish, shellfish, sea mammals, plants, and river mouths. Much of the archaeological evidence for such a journey may now lie beneath the ocean. Travel along the coast may also have involved simple boats. Direct evidence is limited because wood and fiber decay, and ancient shorelines have been submerged. An interior route could still have been used later. The peopling of the Americas may not require one route. Different populations could have entered at different times, using coastal and inland corridors as conditions changed. Ancient DNA reveals rapid population branching after the founding expansion. Groups spread across North America and entered South America within a relatively short period. By at least 14,000 years ago, people were living near the southern end of South America. The distances were immense. Movement may have followed coastlines, rivers, grasslands, and animal populations. No generation experienced the entire migration from Beringia to the southern continent. Like the first movement into Eurasia, it unfolded through thousands of local decisions. The Clovis first model imagined one late entry followed by rapid spread. The newer picture contains earlier populations, possible pauses, multiple routes, and genetic divergence. Some early lineages may have disappeared. Others contributed to later indigenous populations. The settlement of the Americas completed human occupation of nearly every major habitable landmass. But the people who entered Beringia, Sahul, Europe, and East Asia all descended from an earlier demographic transformation. That expansion was not the first time Homo sapiens left Africa. It ranks number one because its descendants endured, multiplied, encountered other humans, and created most of the ancestry carried by people outside Africa today. Number 1. The expansion that created most non-African ancestry. Somewhere between Africa and Eurasia, a human population expanded. The event cannot be reduced to one date. It may not have begun with one group. There was no single moment when humanity left one continent and entered another. Yet genetic evidence shows that most living people outside Africa share much of their ancestry through a broad expansion that became demographically successful. Earlier Homo sapiens populations had already reached the Levant and Arabia. Some may have traveled farther, but their ancestry appears limited in most later non-African populations. The expansion associated with the majority of surviving ancestry occurred later, broadly, between around 90,000 and 50,000 years ago. Different studies produce different estimates because genetic models depend on assumptions about population size, mutation rates, separation, and later mixing. The route remains debated. Some populations may have moved through the Levant. Others may have entered Arabia from northeastern Africa. During humid periods, Arabia contained lakes and grasslands. When sea levels were lower, crossings near the southern Red Sea may have been shorter than they are today, although water still separated the landmasses. The migration may not have involved one isolated tribe. Africa already contained populations with deep and complex histories. Groups separated, reconnected, and exchanged ancestry before and during the expansion. The population that moved into Eurasia may therefore have formed through interactions among several African or Southwest Asian groups. Once outside Africa, they encountered other humans. Neanderthals had occupied Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovan-related populations lived across parts of Asia. The newcomers did not enter an empty continent. Genomes preserve what followed. Most people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived DNA. The pattern shows that interbreeding occurred after the ancestors of those populations expanded beyond Africa. Some inherited variants affected immunity, skin biology, metabolism, and other traits. Not every archaic gene was useful. Many disappeared over time. Others became more common because they helped populations survive local conditions or simply persisted through chance. Farther east, Homo sapiens encountered Denisovan-related populations. The ancestors of Papuan and indigenous Australian peoples inherited substantial Denisovan-related ancestry. Other Asian populations carry smaller amounts from what may have been different Denisovan groups. These encounters transformed the migrating population. The descendants who spread across Eurasia were not genetically identical to the people who first left Africa. They acquired ancestry along the way. This is why the expansion cannot be described as complete replacement moving in one direction. Homo sapiens expanded. Neanderthals and Denisovans eventually disappeared as distinct populations. But parts of them survived within the expanding Homo sapiens population. The descendants of this demographic expansion divided. Some moved into Europe. Some continued through northern and eastern Asia. Others entered South and Southeast Asia. Populations crossed Wallacea and reached Sahul. Much later, groups in northeastern Asia contributed to the ancestry of the first Americans. Almost every later Homo sapiens migration in this countdown depended on branches created by the number one expansion. Its impact was not only geographic. It reorganized the human population structure of the planet. Why did this expansion succeed when earlier Homo sapiens movements did not? There may be no single answer. Population size could have mattered. Larger and better connected communities are less vulnerable to local extinction. Social networks may have moved stone, pigments, ornaments, and information across long distances. Technologies could be shared, altered, and taught. Symbolic communication may have helped maintain alliances and group identity. Environmental conditions may also have opened wider or more stable migration routes. None of these explanations has been proven as the single decisive cause. Earlier Homo sapiens were not necessarily less intelligent. They may simply have been fewer, more isolated, or less fortunate. The successful expansion may also have absorbed some populations already living outside Africa. What appears to be replacement could sometimes include incorporation. Genetics continues to reveal population histories that archaeology alone cannot see. The result was not a simple family tree. It was a network. Branches separated, crossed, and merged. Some disappeared as recognizable populations, while surviving as fragments of ancestry inside others. The people whose descendants spread beyond Africa did not know they were beginning the largest demographic transformation in human prehistory. They were responding to immediate pressures. They followed water, prey, coastlines, rivers, and social connections. One generation moved beyond the range of another. Populations expanded during favorable periods and contracted when conditions worsened. Over thousands of years, their descendants occupied one continent, then several. This migration ranks number one because of what followed. It created the main ancestral foundation for later populations across Europe, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. It brought Homo sapiens into repeated contact with extinct human lineages. It spread populations into nearly every environment on Earth, and it ensured that the human future would belong mainly to one species, even though that species carried pieces of others within it. The migrations in this countdown span more than 2 million years. The earliest hominins entered Eurasia with small brains and simple tools. Neanderthals carried technological traditions across the steppe into Siberia. Denisovan-related populations occupied environments from the Altai Mountains to the Tibetan Plateau and may have reached tropical Asia. Early Homo sapiens entered the Levant and Arabia, then disappeared or left little detectable ancestry. Other populations moved into Southeast Asia, Sahul, Beringia, and the Americas. These journeys were not stages in a planned conquest. They were population experiments. Some lasted only a few generations. Others continued for hundreds of thousands of years. Some produced isolated human forms, as on Flores. Some changed the genomes of populations that arrived later. A migration arrow cannot show the human reality. It cannot show a child learning where water could be found. It cannot show a group deciding whether to cross a river, follow a herd, remain beside a dying lake, or enter a valley they had never seen. It cannot show the people who failed. Every successful migration required continuity. Knowledge had to survive the death of individuals. Tools had to be remade. Roots had to be remembered. Social relationships had to survive changing landscapes. Technology mattered, but so did cooperation. Biology mattered, but culture often allowed people to enter environments for which the human body was poorly adapted. The Arctic could be occupied with clothing, shelter, and fire. Open water could be crossed through flotation and group movement. High altitude could be survived through learned behavior and inherited biology. Deserts could become corridors when rainfall returned. Migration also created encounters. Homo sapiens met Neanderthals. They met Denisovan-related populations. The result was not always separation or conflict. It included interbreeding. Extinct humans remain inside living genomes because migration brought populations together. The evidence is still incomplete. Archaeology favors movements that left durable tools, protected fossils, or recognizable occupation layers. Genetics favors populations that contributed ancestry to descendants available for study. A migration ending in extinction may leave almost nothing. A group relying on wood, fiber, skin, or bamboo could become archaeologically invisible. Coastal settlements may now lie beneath the sea. Tropical bones may have dissolved. Entire journeys may remain beyond the reach of present evidence. Human history was not created by one migration out of Africa. It emerged from repeated expansions, retreats, crossings, encounters, and disappearances. The journeys recovered through archaeology and genetics have transformed what we know about early humans. They have also revealed how much remains unknown. For every migration preserved in a fossil, footprint, tool, or strand of DNA, others may have vanished completely. How many prehistoric human journeys disappeared without leaving a trace?